Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond in for Peter Credlin this week. Well, here's what's coming up on the program tonight. Households could be in for another power price spike as the government weighs up whether to extend the coal price cap. And another major refinery in Western Australia has shut up shop. Plus, all the bizarre items on board NASA's first moon landing attempt in more than 50 years. As technical issues threaten to hinder the mission, I'll speak to our favourite space expert, Brad Tucker, a little later in the show. And the iPhone that survived a fall from a plane nearly 5 kilometres in the sky. How is it that if I drop one from about hip height, it breaks into 5 different pieces, be that as it may? But first, there is something seriously wrong in our schools. Now, I think we kind of already knew that to some degree. We knew the curriculum wasn't up to scratch. We know our academic results are slipping. But to learn today that police were called to schools 20,000 times in New South Wales alone last year, I think makes it abundantly clear how bad things are. That's 53 call-outs every single day. Nearly 3,000 of them were for assault, 685 were for sexual touching, and 411 were for other sexual assaults. There were 210 school days in New South Wales last year, so that's 14 assaults, 3 cases of sexual touching, and 2 sexual assaults every school day. And this is just one state. I mean, extrapolate that out across the rest of the country, and we have a real problem. Now, I'm a young man. I left high school 8 or 9 years ago. I went to a public school in Adelaide's northeastern suburbs, and I reckon the police would have been called to my school maybe a handful of times during my time there. I certainly don't remember there being an issue with assaults bad enough to call the police or any kind of sexual assaults within the school. And the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics says there was a 34% increase in assaults on school grounds between 2021 and 2022, and a 116% increase in sexual offences in the same period. Even when school closures due to COVID are accounted for, both stats are higher. The school system is broken. Students are not getting the education they deserve. And when children have no direction, they start to act out. The numbers are shocking, no doubt about that, but they shouldn't be surprising. The writing has been on the wall for a long time. Nearly half of school children are now failing to meet national standards for reading and maths, according to the latest program for international student assessment results. The average Year 10 student is now a year behind their counterparts 20 years ago. The curriculum has been rewritten umpteen times in that period. Billions upon billions upon billions of dollars have been thrown at the system at the insistence of the unions, and yet nothing has improved. We had a failing system before, now we have an even more expensive failing system. In South Australia, where I am right now, student suspensions have hit record numbers of 5,000, a year. It was between 3,600 and 3,800 a year for a decade. It all fits the trend of there being something wrong with the school system. So what has the Education Department done? Not crack down on bad behaviour or recognise that the system is failing students and that's why you have more problems. No, that'd make too much sense, wouldn't it? Instead, we learn today, they've tightened the rules for suspending students in the hopes it'll mean fewer are sent home. Seems as though they've been to the Anastasia Palaszczuk School of Reducing Crime, because she, as Queensland Premier, changed drug laws so you could be caught with ice, cocaine or heroin 3 times before you faced a criminal charge. If you can't be charged, of course, then you can't show up in the crime statistics. And if it's harder for schools to suspend you, then voila, the suspension stats will go down. Now, principals apparently have to take into account a student's age and developmental stage, amongst other things, when considering suspension. South Australian Education Minister Blair Boyer told the Advertiser today, quote, "We know that Aboriginal children and children with a disability are overrepresented in suspensions and exclusions, And frankly, that's not acceptable. So instead of saying, hang on a minute, we have a bunch of students here who are clearly getting themselves into trouble because they're neglected or they're not being educated properly or they have other problems, you decide you'll make it harder to suspend them. Don't fix the problem. Don't deal with the root cause. Don't help the students. Just say, oh, well, we can't suspend you so easily. Makes the stats look good, but it does nothing to fix the root cause, and that is the education system and the home. The whole thing needs to be blown up and started again. We have to get back to basics. I mean, for one, get the politics out of the classroom. I know I've talked about this before, but a Western Sydney University study last year found that 2/3 of students don't connect with things such as Federation and the Anzacs. They instead say they prefer Indigenous perspectives and learning about the stolen generations and exploring history through refugee stories. That's obviously because the teachers have led them in that direction. And look what we have to show for it. Results going backwards and misbehaviour soaring. The kids are rudderless, and to be quite frank, it's not their fault. It's the fault of those running the system. And some in the system are quite happy with the way things are because it makes their students helpful pawns in their socialist dream. Look at all the kids who've been out protesting for Palestine, for instance. When they're asked why they're there and what it all means, they don't know. They shout Allah Akbar. They're asked what it means. They don't know. What we're doing isn't working. The numbers make it clearer by the day. And if we don't do something about it now, it'll only get worse. Well, joining me now is Nationals MP Keith Pitt to go through the political stories of the day. Keith, thank you for joining me as always, and Happy New Year. Let's start with this US mining giant Alcoa. Now, they announced today that they're going to close their Perth alumina refinery over the coming months. It leaves the future of about 1,100 employees in limbo. We know WA, of course, is a big mining state, a big resources state, and the surplus that the federal government keeps carrying on about is underpinned by all of these resources. Why would such a big business want to pack up and leave Australia?
Oh, firstly, Carl, great to be with you. And secondly, what a terrible start to the year, to 2024, for the more than 700 in the first tranche, individuals who will lose their jobs, and potentially that's 700 families. And the reasons are pretty straightforward. That this is a legacy factory, it's a legacy refinery, it's been around for a long time. According to media reports, it's been underwater by more than $100 million in terms of a loss for the year, last financial year, or the last reporting year. And you now have the impact of Labor government policies, like the safeguard mechanism, like changes to IR, like massive increases in energy costs. And if you're making alumina, well, one of your biggest inputs is electricity and energy costs. It basically sets whether you're profitable or not. So it's not profitable. They're not going to continue, and I think it's a devastating decision, and so much for the sovereign manufacturing capacity of this country that Albanese keeps promising.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got to pay all that money to put the power into the system, as you say, it just becomes unviable. I mean, you know, you think back to, it wasn't power that caused it, but you think back to Holden, for instance, when it was operating here in Australia. You got to a point in terms of producing cars because of the cost of the staff and all the rules they had to adhere to. It simply becomes unviable. And it's not just business, of course, that's dealing with the cost of power. I mean, we keep talking about it. Where's our $275 off that we were promised? And the government's now weighing up whether to extend the coal price cap beyond the mid-year cut-off. Because this cap, I mean, they've credited it, the federal government has credited it with keeping power prices lower than they would otherwise have been. But if the government doesn't extend it, you are probably looking at a spike in power prices because, of course, the value of coal, the price of coal will go up and that flows through to the consumer. But the other thing is that if the government does extend it, these coal generators keep receiving compensation from the federal government. And who pays for that compensation? You and I do. Here's what Treasurer Jim Chalmers had to say about it earlier today.
We've worked with state governments on the coal caps. There hasn't been a decision taken to extend those beyond the middle of the year. But we welcome the ABS making it crystal clear to Australians that if the federal Liberals and Nationals had had their way when they voted against our energy relief plan, electricity prices would have been much higher.
I mean, the reality is, whether you pay for it in your power bill or your tax bill, you're still paying for that increased cost of coal and every other form of power.
Well, Jim Chalmers is out there once again telling Australians just how good they've got it. How good have they got it, Caleb? I don't know anyone whose power bills are going down. They're all going up. And it's actually much more complicated than what's been put forward. And in Queensland, for example, it's absolutely extortionate. You've got somewhere like Callide, where they still haven't got one of their units back online after 2 years, big generator, which would have brought the price down. And don't forget, most of the generators in Queensland, guess who owns them? The Labor government. They also own the mines that supply them and all the connecting infrastructure. And they're now getting subsidised by the federal taxpayer to make sure that they can keep robbing money from Queenslanders who can't afford to pay their power bill now. So it's much more complex than that. And I think Jim Chalmers, he's having a lend of everyone that's listening.
I think he has been for a very long time, to be perfectly honest. Someone who's not having a lend, though, at the moment, I mean, Peter Dutton, in the last few months, has really come to the fore and shown who he can be as a leader. He sort of led the government by the horns at a few points. Another one of the things he's sort of been standing up for, that the government's sort of been out in the wilderness on, is all of this hate speech and anti-Semitism we've seen in recent months. He's been calling for tougher laws on hate speech. I spoke last night to Jewish leaders who, of course, are now saying that if governments and coppers aren't going to do anything about this, we're going to start running civil cases. Dutton has said today that they shouldn't have to foot the bill, that perhaps the government should intervene. How do you think that would work, Keith?
Well, firstly, Peter Dutton's doing a great job. I had him at an event last year, and one of the ladies that attended said, if only Peter could meet 15 or 16 million people, we'd win the next election in a canter. But on this issue, he's exactly right. I mean, why on earth should the Jewish Association have to go and take this action to prevent what shouldn't be happening in the first place? And at a federal level, mate, this is one of the challenges we've had, even with the Religious Discrimination Bill, for example. How do you legislate for tolerance? It's something that people should just have, and they should behave appropriately, and we shouldn't be seeing these types of things, particularly in Australia. I mean, this is something you'd expect to see in war-torn parts of the world, not Western Sydney. So I think Dutz is exactly right. He is on the money here. Action needs to be taken, and it shouldn't be up to associations to take it on, and the police should be doing their job, and if the laws aren't working, well, let's change them.
Yeah, and by the way, the Victoria Police revealed today that they had a rise in hate crimes in the state over the past 3 months. They said they'd investigated more than 100 anti-Semitic crimes in Melbourne since the October 7 attacks, which I would think is a bit lower than what's actually happened. But I just want to note the fact that only 12 things related to Islamophobia were investigated. Remember when they were telling us, anti-Semitism, but also we've got to worry about Islamophobia? It has not been a thing. Keith Pitt, thank you so much for your time tonight, mate.
Great to be with you.
Well, returning to what I spoke about at the top of the show, there's been a concerning spike in violence across New South Wales schools, with new data revealing police were called almost 20,000 times in the last year for serious incidents on school grounds, an average of 53 call-outs per day. Joining me now is education expert Kevin Donnelly. Kevin, teachers and youth mental health advocates have pointed the finger at increased anxiety and social deterioration among students, particularly since the COVID pandemic. You've done a lot of research in this area. Would you agree with their assessment?
Well, that's only partly the reason, Caleb. And it's a complicated issue, as any parent or teacher would know, but it gets back initially to parenting. I mean, for far too long now, parents have often indulged their children. Children go to school not respecting authority, not being disciplined in the home. So it really does begin with parents, and they have to ensure when their children go to school that they respect teachers, they respect other students, and they know that there are consequences if they misbehave or do the wrong thing. Equally, teachers and classrooms need to be more disciplined. And as you well know, it's been reported now for over a year or two, we have among the most disruptive and badly behaved students in terms of the classroom across the OECD. So teachers need to do more. They need to be more authority figures. We need to get rid of all those progressive ideas like open classrooms, which they're doing in New South Wales. And we need to get back to a more structured, disciplined classroom.
Yeah, well, the system, as I was saying before, as it is now, doesn't work. And you've got New South Wales, the state government is preparing to roll out their new student behaviour policy, which will have no limit on how many times a school student can be suspended. But then you go down to South Australia, where I'm sitting tonight, their education department and state government's going in the other direction. They're bringing in new rules to try and reduce the number of students being kicked out of the classroom because they had record levels of suspensions and expulsions a year ago, 5,000 of them. And so they're like, OK, we've got to do something about it. Forget about actually doing anything to help those kids or sort out the classroom. We'll just go, OK, well, if we make it harder to suspend them, we can basically diddle the numbers.
Well, it won't work, and we all know that. And I mean, I'll make the point that we need to give schools greater autonomy and greater flexibility. I mean, in Australia, across all the different states and territories, there's too much government regulation, too much red tape. We need to give schools greater flexibility. And I mean, it can be done. In London, we have the Michaelia School. In Sydney, there's a very good school, Marsden Road Public School, headed up by Manisha Gazula. They're schools where it's an environment where teachers are authority figures, students know there are consequences, they have to line up before the class, they have to be wearing the proper uniform, they have to sit quietly, they only talk to the teacher when they're asked a question or working in groups. So it is possible to turn this around, but unfortunately, as you mentioned in the intro, all the effort, all the attention at the moment is going to woke causes, climate change, whether it's Palestine, Gaza. We're spending too much time on this progressive wokeism rather than getting back to the basics and ensuring that what happens in the classroom is based on what is the most effective pedagogy, where teachers are not indoctrinating students, but are actually subject experts.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, you've got all these teachers carrying on about Palestine, and teachers down in Victoria who've been going to protests and using their classrooms to share their views with their students. Apparently they're now in line for disciplinary action, or so they claim, because there's a bunch of teachers, they're planning to hold a forum before the school year comes back to discuss how they're promoting Palestine in the classroom and all this nonsense. And they claim they've been threatened with action from the Education Department due to anti-Semitism. Just very quickly, Kevin, if that's the case, I'd be surprised because not much has happened to this point, but about time.
Well, the real problem here, and I wrote about this in the Daily Telegraph last week, this is only the most recent example. It's been happening for 20, 30 years, whether it was the Iraqi war, condemning the Howard government, climate change, Al Gore's video went popular. So it's something that's been there for a long time. And hopefully one day, as many parents are beginning to, we'll wake up to the fact that schools are not what they should be. And we need to get them back to an academic focus where teachers are subject experts and they're actually teaching rather than indoctrinating.
Kevin Donnelly, thank you so much for your time. Well, after the break, technical issues threaten NASA's first mission to the moon in more than 50 years. We'll speak to a space expert about this, plus the bizarre items that are on board. That's up next. Well, if you were watching us last night, you would have seen these live pictures of a rocket launching from Cape Canaveral in Florida. This NASA-backed mission by tech company Astrobotic is the first US moon landing attempt in more than 50 years. And if it's successful, it'd make history as the first private business to land on the moon. They're privatising everything these days. Joining me now is ANU astrophysicist and cosmologist Brad Tucker. Brad, thank you for your time. Firstly, talk us through the aim of this mission. It's the first time in a long time they've tried to go near the moon. What do they want to do?
Yeah, so this is part of NASA's commercial launch payload service. And the idea is that as NASA goes back to the moon as part of its broader Artemis missions, the actually sending of people, there's a lot of experiments and cargo and equipment that needs to go up with it. And in fact, that should be relatively straightforward. So they've been working and supporting a number of private companies to make it cheaper and more effective to do this. And it is a lot cheaper and it is a lot more effective. There's multiple companies that are doing this. So there's not just one egg in one basket. And therefore really paving an easy way, hopefully, in the future of sending lots of things, research equipment, some stranger things that we just saw and we'll probably talk about in a second as well, to the moon. So it's part of this larger umbrella and really the first step in getting humans more semi-permanently on the moon.
I mean, why would you want to live on the moon? Stupid question, but why on earth would you want to live on the moon? I mean, I know we've been talking about Mars, but the moon? Unless it's like that episode of Wallace and Gromit where they go out there and eat cheese and crackers, but come on.
Yeah, that's right. Well, someone has to send all those crackers ahead of time, right? No, the idea is that the moon is going to be that stepping stone to Mars. So it's less of an individual person on the moon, but rather having astronauts there on a semi-regular rotation basis, kind of a fly-in, fly-out type thing, running experiments, running equipment, and building the facilities and setting up the facilities to actually go to Mars. So the moon is really a stepping stone, as everyone view, to Mars. It has a lot of resources we can use, in particular water. Ice contained on the moon in the form of water can be used for water for drinking, but you can break up that H2O into hydrogen and oxygen. In fact, that's rocket fuel. So there's a lot of reasons for the forward thinking to establish ourselves on the moon. And so part of that is this semi-permanent presence of distant astronauts. And to do so, they need the equipment and research to be there in part ahead of time, not just on the rocket they take themselves.
Well, maybe if they put a resort up there, I'd consider it for a holiday, because it'd be a good way to get away from some people you don't want to see for a little while. But there's reports that the lunar lander suffered some technical problems a few hours after liftoff. Is there a chance that maybe it won't make it at all?
Yeah, so, and firstly, as you said, you were showing the rocket launch itself. And in fact, the Vulcan rocket was actually a new rocket system by United Launch Alliance. So in fact, there was two big milestones here, and the rocket worked perfectly, put that spacecraft into orbit. Now, essentially, they do a very elliptical orbit that they slowly push out further and further and head to the moon. After a few hours of going around the Earth, they realized the propellant and the propulsion system wasn't allowing them to orientate the spacecraft such that it could face the sun so that the solar panels can charge the batteries. And that was really the first sign that they had. After a while, they realized there was a fault in the propulsion system and it caused some sort of fuel leak. Where it stands now is the batteries have charged. They have at least gotten the spacecraft to get the solar panels to work. It seems unlikely they will be able to have enough fuel and enough control of the propulsion system to do a soft landing, i.e. nicely controlled on the moon's surface. So we'll learn in a few hours now whether they decide, can they go to the moon at all? Because if they can go to the moon at least, they can probably enter the moon's orbit, and some of those experiments on board can still achieve their goals, not all of them. And even though they may not be able to land, still accomplish something. So that's probably what they're going to be aiming for now. Of course, they can get to the moon and do what we call a hard landing, which is a very polite way of saying crash. That doesn't achieve that much, so we'll probably see some of this intermediary option come to play. But again, we'll know a little bit more in about 6 or so hours from now.
And I mean, the stuff they've got on it too. I mean, apparently there's a piece of rock from Mount Everest. There's DNA from former president. They've got human remains from the creator of Star Trek. They've got artworks. I mean, they're going to be well set up on the moon, that's for sure. Brad Tucker, thank you so much for your time. Well, let's go from outer space to the Sunshine State. Now I'm thinking about being on the moon. Joining me now is Queensland Opposition Leader David Crisafulli. David, I'm sure sometimes you wish you were on the moon, living up under Stephen Miles there in Queensland. He's admitted today that more needs to be done to fix the youth crime crisis that's plagued the state for years. I'm glad he's woken up. He's met with representatives from the Voice for Victims advocacy group. They've given him until January 19, 10 days, to respond in writing about how the government plans to address youth crime, or they've threatened to hold more protests. They've described the meeting they had as being heated at times. You couldn't argue that Palaszczuk did a good job of handling youth crime. Will Stephen Miles be any different?
Well, if he admits more needs to be done, great. We've got a solution on the table right now. Remove detention as a last resort. Unshackle the judiciary. Rewrite that Youth Justice Act, and we're ready, mate. We'll go back to Parliament tomorrow if he's serious about it. You can say more needs to be done, but the solutions are on the table. We've been putting them on the table for 3 years. We've sat in lounge rooms of people who've had their lives torn apart. I've sat with people who have lost loved ones. The solutions are there. Rewrite the Youth Justice Act, remove detention as a last resort, get serious about early intervention, fix the broken resi care system. They're all things that the government could do tomorrow, not just pay lip service. And right now, youth crime is ripping a hole through this state from one end to the other. And it's a priority for me because it's a priority for Queenslanders.
Well, victims are calling for a royal commission to be held into youth crime. Would you hold one if you won the state election this year?
I'll tell you what I will do, and that is on day one make it the first bit of legislation we deal with, and I'm not ruling anything in or out, and I've said that all along. I want victims to know that we're listening. I want Queenslanders to know we're serious about this, and we're going to do absolutely everything that it takes. But I can promise you it'll be the first bill that we take to Parliament because we're serious about it.
We'll move on. Stephen Miles again. He's saying he's going to push ahead with this Path to Treaty program. Now, obviously, we know that the Voice referendum was defeated quite resoundingly in Queensland. The no vote was very strong. You changed the opposition's policy on this last year. There was initial soft support for treaty that you reversed, and rightly so. Why can Miles not see, given the result of the Voice, that this is potentially electoral poison?
Queenslanders spoke and I listened, and the government's not listening. And so they can embark on whatever process they want. I've been upfront and clear that referendum, the way that I saw it unfold, the Prime Minister did not listen to the warning bells. He was told repeatedly that it would divide the nation. He was told repeatedly it wouldn't deliver what he said it was going to deliver, and he didn't listen. Now, I'm not like Prime Minister Albanese. I do listen, and Queenslanders spoke overwhelmingly. Now, my focus is going to be on making sure that we can get people into a job, getting a house, doing something about youth crime. That's going to be my focus, and I intend to make sure that every Queenslander, including those Indigenous communities that I've been to all of them. I was in one just the other day in Wujal, looking at the devastation following Cyclone Jasper and the flooding that came from that. So I'm serious about it. But if the government wants to be pig-headed, if they want to continue down this path, Queenslanders will speak again. But I am telling Queenslanders I have heard the message, and it's not on the agenda, and our focus is going to be on outcomes, which is what I've always wanted from this. I've always wanted a focus to be on the absolute dire shortage of education, employment, home ownership. That's important to me.
Yeah, and you can spend all that money on treaty and all these other things and achieve nothing. Makes us feel warm and fuzzy, a bit like talking about Australia Day. But if you're not doing anything practical, there's really no point. Now, last night we spoke to a Brisbane nurse who's been sacked from her job because she refused to get the COVID jab 2 years ago. Now, the state government lifted the vaccine mandate and they have still sacked her. Take a listen.
There's no sensible reason why they would continue with this action. We know that our hospitals are screaming out for staff. We're seeing ambulances ramped outside, people dying in ambulances. Our rural areas are really suffering, but they just continue and they will not engage on this issue. I don't know why they bothered to drop the mandate if they were going to continue firing people. I'm one of at least 50 since September 25.
Given the health crisis that Queensland is in, you've got critical staff shortages. What possible reason could there be to sack a nurse after the vaccine mandate has been lifted?
Well, nurses are leaving in droves from Queensland Health. They feel battered, broken and bruised, and here's one who wants to go to work and she can't. Now, I stood up the other day with the Shadow Health Minister, Ros Bates, and we said to the Minister, well, hang on, the requirements were lifted. You said that really clearly. Clearly, that doesn't apply to this person. Now, we've repeatedly asked that question and we haven't got an answer. So we're going to keep asking that question on behalf of her and everybody else. Rules are there and you've got to apply rules fairly. And the Minister hasn't answered that question and we're going to keep pursuing it.
As well you should. Now, as we mentioned earlier, obviously we're in an election year for you up in Queensland now. And the Prime Minister's thrown his support, unsurprisingly I suppose, behind Stephen Miles. He's called him a Labor hero who's going to win the election. Take a listen to this.
Look, Anastasia Palaszczuk was a very good Premier of Queensland. She's a friend of mine. She won 3 elections in a row. She's a Labor hero. This bloke here is going to be a Labor hero when he wins the next election, held later this year.
He's got to be the most awkward Labor hero I've ever seen, David.
I'll tell you what, Caleb, I don't agree with everything that Prime Minister Albanese says, but I don't disagree with everything he says either. And he said a little while ago, governments don't get better in their 4th term. I reckon he was on the money when he said that.
Very good. Touche. And before you go, there was some commentary in the Courier Mail today suggesting that if you promise to ditch the Olympics, it'll guarantee you as the state's next Premier. There was a survey a few days ago that said 66% of people don't support the Brisbane Olympics. 74% said they wouldn't attend a sporting event during the Games. Seems to be becoming a bit more obvious that perhaps Queensland can't afford this. Is this something you would consider?
Well, I can tell you why there's frustration, Caleb, and that is it's been over 900 days since we were awarded the Games. And 900 days ago, we were promised that this was going to be a generational opportunity, that all levels of government would come together and the focus would be on infrastructure. In the last 900 days, all we've heard the government talk about is a sporting stadium and a big party for the rich and the famous and who gets the best tickets. Now, that's not my priority and that's not what Queenslanders want. Now, Queenslanders will pull behind the event, but it's got to be about generational infrastructure. It's got to be about building road and rail. It's got to be about a 20-year tourism strategy to make sure we develop new product and then have the eyes of the world on us and promote our great state. It's got to be about improving communications, a housing strategy. We've heard none of that from the government. Absolutely none. And that's why there's a level of resentment from the community. But I want to unite the state. And I want Queenslanders to know that my view is not like the government. I don't want to be a control freak and take everything in. I want to have an independent infrastructure delivery authority, and my focus won't be on stadiums. It'll be on generational infrastructure so every single part of this state can be better for the next generation.
And fair enough. I mean, look, we already lost the Commonwealth Games in Victoria. Imagine if we lost the Olympic Games in Queensland as well. Goodness me. David Crisafulli, thank you so much for your time. Well, after the break, the council are promising to axe welcome to country ceremonies. The Pope's call to ban surrogacy. And how much would you pay someone to stand in a queue for you? That and more coming up next with my panel. Well, a Western Sydney councillor has vowed to scrap the welcome to country and smoking ceremonies in his council if his party is re-elected this year. He says it no longer reflects the needs of the residents who voted a resounding no in the Voice referendum. Joining me now is Sky News contributors Gary Hardgrave and Jason Morrison. Jason, what a nice change. A leader who's actually saying, yep, look, we've said no to all this nonsense. We don't want it anymore. A couple of councils in South Australia have already done it. Maybe the message is finally getting through.
I don't think the message is even close to getting through. This bloke is being honest and upfront because he's running independently and he's not part of the party machinery. So he's decided to do really a point of difference, and his point of difference will get him swept to power. I'd be stunned if not, because people have had it with this, not because they've got a problem necessarily with Aboriginal people or Aboriginality or Australia's history, but they've got a fair dose of them with the tokenism. It's become the kind of good thanks, how are you response to everything. We say it so often now, it's just lost relevance. And I mean, I was at the cricket the other day and you get asked to stand for the national anthem, but before the national anthem, you get asked to stand for the welcome to country, as if it is, you know, something that requires stance for reverence. It's kind of got so far out of control in society, and I'm not surprised that he's looked at an opportunity here based on the pure statistics. The statistics tell you that people are jack of it.
Yeah. But you failed to mention there, Jason, that they now say stand if you can for the national anthem.
That's right.
You know, you wouldn't want to offend someone who's got a gammy leg, would you? But Gary, this is, you know, it takes someone to stand up and say, look, I'm not going to do this anymore, in order for others to be able to sort of take the cue and follow, right?
Well, I think so. And after this bloke wins as Mayor of Cumberland, I hope he runs for the position of the boss of Qantas, the boss of Wesfarmers, the boss of all of the companies that come off Wesfarmers. Because, frankly, so much of our life is wasted from all these people who want to signal the virtue of welcoming to our own country. Look, I take the lead off Warren Mundine, Jacinta Price. They're two terrific Australians who have proudly Aboriginal heritage. They see this as a divisive thing. And so should anybody with any common sense. But, of course, we have Clover Moore. We have that Mayor of Melbourne, whatever her name is. Look, I mean, whenever it is all said, and it is said a lot, this is not a way of bringing people together. It's a way of hiving people off. And what we have to do in Australia is have leaders and elect leaders who want to bring us all together. They don't ask us our culture, don't ask us our religion. They just say, are you Australian? You're part of the deal. Be who you are, be for Australia, and let's all get on with each other. That's pretty simple to my mind.
It's funny, it once used to be irrelevant about where you were from and what you're about and what your creed is and whatever else.
Used to be.
It was just, you know, you're part of it. If we could get the message to the ABC, the few times I tune in, the number of times I'm greeted to my country being broadcast from another country, because the thing they haven't got their head around yet is if they're coming out of Melbourne, it's kind of not really right to say g'day and welcome to this land, because the land I'm in, or the land that Gary's in, where Gary is, or for that matter you, mate, where you're in South Australia, it's a very different country. But they haven't got their head around that yet, because it's all about making sure people know what you're about. Yeah.
Oh, mate. And look, I'll admit, I listen to Classic FM. I still call it Classic FM, not ABC Classic, as they tried to change it to. But every time they have a piece of music that has either been composed or performed in Australia, they have to tell you the Aboriginal land on which it was performed. I mean, they're performing some Tchaikovsky. It's got absolutely nothing to do with Aboriginality, but they make sure they get it in. Now, Pope Francis, Gary, has called for a global ban on surrogacy. He said that the practice of carrying another person's child is deplorable. He said it's a grave violation of the dignity of the woman and child, and that a child is always a gift and never the basis of a commercial contract. Now, when he's talking about commercial surrogacy, which is illegal in every state in Australia, I totally agree. I don't know, though, that a total ban on surrogacy, you know, if someone in your family or a friend offers to help you have a child, surely that should be okay.
Well, I'm not going to be the moral arbiter in all of this. I think there's a higher authority above even His Holiness the Pope, who might have more of a say in all of this based on Christian teaching and indeed Islam's teaching and the Jewish community. I mean, people of the book, like I guess us, understand that it's not really up for us to judge. But look, I think this whole thing is a dreadful slap across the chops for anybody going through a surrogacy at the moment. So you're right, the absolutism of a total ban, it might have worked in the 1820s, but I'm not sure it works in the 2020s. And I think His Holiness is equally searching for some relevance after going incredibly left and woke on everything else. I mean, he tells us, like the people from the United Nations, that the planet is boiling, that somehow or other the false god of climate change is more important than the real god he's meant to be the franchise owner of. I mean, I am just left. This guy is searching for relevance. I hope he toddles off into the sunset and sometime soon so we can get a sensible Pope back into the Vatican.
I agree with you 100%.
Can I just clear this up? He can't wander off into the sunset. He's got to drop dead. He's got to die. So, Gary, you just called for the Pope to...
You can retire. You can retire. It did happen. Benedictine retired.
Twice.
Benedict retired.
Yeah. Look, the hippie Pope...
Oh, dear. Oh, Gary.
And I can say this as a Catholic.
We'll get you in a bit of trouble here. It's okay. It's all entertainment for us, Gary. If you get in a bit of trouble, we'll still be here next week. But, you know, you could put a job up on Airtasker. Does someone else want to be the Pope? There's a woman in Sydney. She paid someone $280.
She can't be the Pope. She can't be the
Pope. She can't be the Pope. You're right. But she paid someone $280 to line up for a box of apparently famous pastries to buy them for her because she couldn't bear to stand in line. Apparently, this is a thing now, Jason. I mean, you've got to have more money than sense in order to spend $280 to get someone to line up for you. Is there anything you would pay $280, a mundane task, you would pay someone $280 to do?
Geez, you got me. A mundane task that I'd pay someone $280. There are plenty of mundane tasks I pay that to. They're mundane because I don't know how to do them. and the tradesmen and women of Australia enjoy the benefits of it. I worked for someone quite some years back who was sort of a major public Australian company who used to have his secretary sit on the phone all day in the days when before the internet, and you used to be on the phone to make phone calls for buying tickets.
Outrageous.
She had to sit there for days and days to get tickets for his kids to go to concerts, and the kids never missed out. They always got great tickets and great seats, and you could thank the secretary for that. So I guess indirectly that someone was paying for that. Someone was. It might have been just the shareholders of the company, but yeah.
Dearie me. And look, just before we get to the break, we won't have time to discuss it, but I just can't get over this. Man in Oregon in the US, he found an iPhone that belonged to a passenger from that Alaska Airlines flight that had to make that emergency landing after the door flew off. He found the phone completely intact. I mean, Can you imagine? You drop your phone when you're on your way to the toilet and it breaks into a million pieces. And this thing, you can see it there, is 100% intact and fell out of the sky. Some people have all the luck, eh? Jason Morrison, Gary Hardgrave, thank you so much for joining me as always.
Okay.
It's always a great pleasure. Well, after the break, South Africa takes on Israel at the UN's highest court over the war in Gaza. Don't go away. Well, the International Court of Justice is set to begin hearings later this week after South Africa filed a case against Israel, accusing it of violating the Genocide Convention in its war on Hamas. Joining me now is Sparked Online's chief political writer, Brendan O'Neill. Brendan, what a ridiculous waste of time all of this is. The US has hit out about it. What on earth is South Africa playing at?
You know, I think South Africa is behaving disgracefully here. You know, this is not a genocide. This is a war. And by the way, it's a war that Hamas started with its unprovoked attack on the civilians of Israel on the 7th of October. It is a grotesque lie to accuse Israel of genocide. And I think actually it's even worse than that. We're witnessing an inversion of morality because it was Israel that was attacked by a genocidal terror organization on the 7th of October. And yet it's Israel that is now being accused of genocide. It was Israel that was subjected to this fascistic assault, and yet it's now Israel that has been likened to the fascists. You know, it was the people of southern Israel who were subjected to the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And yet everywhere you look, it is Israel that is being compared to the architects of the Holocaust. This is an inversion of reality, an inversion of truth, and an inversion of morality itself. And I think South Africa should be ashamed of itself for bringing this case, and all its cheerleaders in the Western media should be ashamed of themselves too. They're projecting the sins of Hamas onto the victims of Hamas, and that is really out of order.
Indeed. Now, USA Boxing is facing a backlash over its transgender policy, which would allow male boxers who transition to fight in the female category from this year. I mean, you know, it's bad enough having these trans women who go into swimming and athletics and all this other stuff and break individual records, but it's another thing entirely when it comes to a combat sport. You're going to start throwing men, biological men who've grown up with the testosterone coursing through their bodies, bigger hands, more strength, all of that, and you're going to allow them to stand in the ring with women. What could go wrong?
It's completely insane. This is surely the most insane stage of trans activism so far. You know, people will say that USA Boxing's rules are quite strict. So, for example, if you're born male, you have to have full gender reassignment surgery. You have to prove that your testosterone is quite low before you can fight against a woman. But as you say, you know, puberty gives the biological male huge physical advantages over women. Larger muscle mass, denser muscles, longer arms, larger hands, larger heart and lung capacity, more strength. All of these advantages come through the process of puberty, and they don't go away just because a man, when he hits the age of 20, starts taking some estrogen tablets. So this is a case where it's almost like we are legalizing gender-based violence. USA Boxing is basically making a sport out of male battery of women. I think this male invasion of women's sports has got to stop. You know, born males are stealing medals from women in cycling, swimming, track and field, and now potentially in boxing too. Leave women's sports alone. No one who was born male should ever take part in a women's sport. That's my view.
100%. And no one who was born male should be going around beating up women either. I thought that was a pretty straightforward one. Before you go, more of these Jeffrey Epstein documents have been unsealed today. They're now claiming that Prince Andrew, former US President Bill Clinton, who we knew both of them were on the list, and the British billionaire Sir Richard Branson of Virgin fame, were involved in sex tapes filmed by Epstein. How much traction is this getting, and how likely do you think we would be to ever hear from the royal family or Prince Andrew on all of this?
It's getting a lot of traction here because of Prince Andrew and because he seems to be named quite a lot in these documents. I don't think we'll hear anything from the royal family. I don't think King Charles is going to make a comment. But at the same time, I don't think Prince Andrew is going to come back into the fold anytime soon. I think he's done now. I don't think he's going to be a prominent member of the royal family ever again. You know, something very fishy clearly happened on that island. You know, it seems to have been incredibly decadent and potentially even quite depraved behavior. So there are question marks swirling around some of these public figures. I think Prince Andrew, his day in the sun is over, and he still has questions to answer. Whether he answers them or not remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I still get the feeling though about Andrew that obviously all that money was paid to pay off Virginia Giuffre, and that all sort of disappeared off into the wilderness. And Andrew really has not had his day. He's not had his opportunity to pay his penance to, I mean, you know, he's never going to be locked up. He's not going to get to do his time in that way, but surely he's got to face some kind of reckoning in some way. Brendan O'Neill, thank you so much for your time tonight. Well, thank you for your company tonight as well. Up next is the Bolt Report with Andrew Bolt. You'll see me again here tomorrow at 6.